A lot of people think being a loan officer is just sitting at your desk talking about rates all day. But most people don't actually know what goes into the job on a day in, day out basis. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am your host, Sam Enright. And guys, today we are back with a solo podcast episode. It has probably been, 5-6 months since we've done a solo podcast. So today, Zach will not be with us. So we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about a new topic. So I actually had a client that I was speaking with, and I had mentioned to him that we do a podcast, and he was like, you should do a podcast episode about, the career path of being a loan officer or mortgage advisor and what all goes into that. So I was kind of brainstorming, how we wanted to structure that episode and I don't obviously want to sit here and just go through the how to become licensed and that sort of thing. That will be part of it, but also talk about a little bit of what actually goes on behind the scenes and what a day in the life or a week or a month or a year in the life of being a loan officer actually looks like and what the job, all entails, so that you guys have a better understanding. And if any of you are actually interested in maybe pursuing that career path, or just want to know a little bit more about, what the people that you work with that help you get home loans are doing on a day-to-day basis, this should be a good episode for you guys to get a little bit more insight into that. So yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So first thing I wanted to talk with you guys about is why people want to become a loan officer or a mortgage advisor, and what is the calling to that career path and what gets people started in that. So obviously I can't speak for everyone, but I can speak for myself and kind of talk about, the different loan officers and people that I know in the industry and, kind of what is, a little bit of their reasonings behind that or what I've seen. And I think one of the biggest things, we have to get started with this is you have to be people oriented. You have to be wanting to help people. Obviously, this is a people business. So everything that we do on a day-to-day basis is communicating with clients, communicating with real estate agents, title companies, appraisers, the whole nine. So there are roles within inside, a mortgage industry in which that is not necessarily the case. People that maybe handle a little bit more paperwork and that, but a loan officer is very much so a blend. So you're going to have obviously administrative paperwork, things that go into loan applications, but a lot of it is people centric. So you're going to be on the phone talking with people, meeting with clients in person. So I think one of the biggest draws to this business for most people is always going to be being around and involved with people. So if you like people, this would be obviously a great place to start. I think a couple of other reasons that people would get into this business is income opportunity. Of course, you can go look up on Google what your average loan officer makes, in your city or state, kind of get an idea of what that income potential looks like. I know loan officers, there's loan officers out there in the world that make over millions of dollars a year. There's loan officers that, make around 60, 70, 80. And so there's all the earning potential in between, right? So that is the nice thing, is the income opportunity. It is one of those businesses that, you don't necessarily need a college degree to get it started in. And the income opportunity there for you is rather large if obviously you are someone who can be very, very successful in that business and you're good with people and good with building relationships. You don't necessarily really have much of an income cap, and we'll talk about why that is, a little bit later in the episode. But another big thing is flexibility with hours and time worked. So, it's one of those businesses where, and I guess maybe to explain the structure of it before we get into that would make a little bit more sense for you guys. So obviously there's three different types of, mortgage loan officers or like a mortgage broker. So you have your loan officers that would work for a bank. You have a mortgage banker, which is the type of company that I work for. And then you also have a mortgage broker. So inside of the structure of a mortgage banker, obviously we have a company behind us. We have underwriters, we have closers, we have an operations team that, sees getting the loans from the beginning to the end. It helps us along with that. But the structure is very much so, if you are a loan officer, it is kind of a what you bring to the table is what you ultimately get, right? So, in our company, we don't necessarily pay for leads or do anything like that. It's all very much so a relationship based business. So you create relationships with different people out there. You help family members, friends, and just different people that now know that you're in that business come to you, and you help them get a home loan and help them buy their home. So when it comes to flexibility, ultimately, a lot of that is you're not necessarily tied to a desk day in and day out. You have the ability to get out, meet people, build those relationships, move around. And it's not as if though you have a clock in, clock out system, so to speak. When you're a loan officer, it's very much so you are responsible for bringing your own business to the table. It's not, again, you don't have to clock in and clock out every day and be there for a set amount of hours. So there is that flexibility on it that comes in. And then I think obviously, one of the other things is just being interested in real estate as a whole, whether that's, obviously we're doing the lending side of things, but if you're interested in homes and, that process of really just helping people purchase their home, whether that's a first, a second, a third, an investment property, any of those different things, is really a main reason why people want to get into the business. So I think the overarching theme that you'll hear most people say is freedom and opportunity. It does not operate like a normal job, and it does have a large potential for income earnings. And so when you combine those two things, that is a very attractive thing for most people when they're considering getting started in the business. So, getting into the next topic of conversation here, we're going to talk about how you actually get licensed, what that looks like. So, I took a little bit of a unique journey myself. My dad has been in the mortgage business for, at this point, 27 years. So, he got involved a little bit after I was born. And he's had some time off and on, but my dad was, the person who introduced me to, the mortgage business, and I knew about it growing up. And obviously when I turned 18 and got a little bit past that, I worked some odds and end jobs, and I was looking for a different career path for myself. And, I went down and spent some time with my dad and my uncle and met the owner of our company and came home, and I was like, you know what, I want to get licensed. I want to pursue this. And so I actually found, well, my dad found a mortgage academy that kind of teaches you all the ins and outs of the business, teaches you the different loan programs, gives you a backstory into, lending industry and everything that's made it what it is today. And then also there was a second part of that schooling that teach you how to structure loans, teach you how to understand a little bit more of what goes into that. And so that is not a requirement. I do want to put that out there. That was something that was, we discussed it and thought that it might be good because I really didn't have much backstory into the business other than just what, my experience of watching my dad growing up being in it. So I decided to take the course and did that. I think I did that for a couple of months. It took me a couple of months to get through it. It was a pretty large course. I got like these big binders of notes and everything that I took. But again, not something that is required in order to get licensed, but something that we felt was a good prerequisite for me to start with. So in order to get licensed, it is a little bit different state by state, but there are a mandatory 20 hours of online education that you have to do. They may do in-person education for this. I'm not sure. What I did was an online course through mortgageeducators.com. You do a 20-hour course. You have 2 weeks to complete it. So it's kind of go at your own pace. But again, you have that 2-week deadline in which it has to be done. At least that's how it was. This again was 8 years ago. So things could have changed, but giving you guys the experience that I had from back then. And so I went to the schooling first and then did the 20 hours that I needed. And then sometimes each state may have its own additional requirements. So I believe Ohio has another 4 hours of education that you have to do. Once that education is complete, then you would sign up for your mortgage licensing exam. So you have to find an authorized place that does the exams. You get yourself set up, you pay for the fee. It's a lot like getting licensed for, I guess, really anything else. I mean, I know like if you're a nurse or different lines of work that require a license, you have to go take an exam, pass it. And then obviously, that is kind of then you start to get your licensing, pay for the fees and all that sort of stuff. But I went out and signed up for the test. I did fail the very first time. You have to get like a 75% minimum. I think I ended up getting like a 73%. So I was very close. Had a couple of I marked like 30 questions for review, and I went back on those 30, changed some answers. And so the next time I was like, absolutely not. I'm going with my gut. As soon as I see it, we're going to go. We're not marking any for review. End up going back the second time, passing the exam. And then the NMLS is the organization that manages licenses for mortgage professionals. So they communicate with the exam company. They let you know that you passed, and then you go in and you have to do like a background check, credit report, and then pay for your fees to get initially licensed. Once you do all of that, then you are officially a licensed loan officer. At which point I got hired on with the company that I still work with now, Case and Home Loans. And that was really where the journey began for me. So a little bit of additional information on the licensing front. For a mortgage educator, you do have 8 hours of continued education that you have to do every year. And sometimes there is state specific additional education that you have to do. I do believe that there is no additional requirement for Ohio. I think you just do your 8 hours and you're good. So 8 hours every year has to be done by, typically we try to get it done before December starts, because you do have to get that to report to the NMLS and then pay for your license renewal. So it's a license renewal every year, 8 hours education or continued education every year as well. So I do that online and pay for my license renewal every year around December. Good for the upcoming year, rinse and repeat. So sometimes you do have to do updated background checks, every couple of years or something like that. So they'll let you know on that front. But, this is obviously the very technical side of it, right? So, you have your 20 hours required, sometimes a little bit of additional if you're in a specific state, and then you are able to pay for your licensing, or you take your test. As long as you pass, then you can pay for your licensing fees and you will officially be a licensed mortgage loan officer. So I do know that I was actually talking with a new hire that we have and looking into some courses and stuff, and they do still have some of those courses out there where you can learn a little bit more about the industry before actually going in and taking that test. I will be honest, I don't know that the course before the 20 hours really helped a bunch when it came to the actual exam itself. I feel like a lot of the information was in that 20-hour course that helped me pass the exam, not necessarily in the prerequisite. So obviously, when you're doing such large courses and finding out about a business that is very, very intricate, it can be a very hard to almost retain that information. So in my personal opinion, obviously, I learned a lot more by getting involved in the industry, learning as time went on. Obviously, when I started, I was green and didn't understand really much of anything. And as the last 8 years have progressed, little by little, I've continued to learn more about mortgage lending guidelines, credit reports, income, the whole nine, right? And so obviously I still have a lot more to learn. There's still things that I have questions on, and I don't think I'll ever stop learning. A large part of that is due to the fact that guidelines are always updating. The lending institutions are always changing, for conventional FHA, USDA, VA, and then you get into your non-QM program. So there's always a lot to learn, which is one of the parts that I really enjoy about the business as well. I am a big person who's a big proponent of learning constantly. And, I do like that part of it. So you're never going to reach the point where you know everything, in my personal opinion. So you always have more to learn, which I think is awesome. Getting into a little bit more of, kind of, the loan officer side of things. So, I've taken a little bit of a different path in my time in the last 8 years. And, I think I've talked with you guys about this on a previous episode where, Zach and I talked about how we got started in the business. But, I've been a processor, I've been an assistant, I have moved into a loan officer assistant role. I've done all kinds of different things. I've helped pre-approve clients. I've, done the back end stuff of getting loans to the closing table, really kind of experienced all of it. And so, I have a little bit of a unique perspective on that maybe not all loan officers have. A lot of loan officers get licensed and they're right out there getting business, and, maybe they don't ever really learn what a processor does or that side of things. And so, they probably know what they do, but maybe not as in depth enough to know how to do those things themselves. And so, I felt like that helped me along my journey of building confidence, is just, experiencing all these different things and really continuing to stack, build, learn, and grow from there has produced a level of confidence in myself and knowing that, I can help people and help get these loans to the closing table and get people in their homes in an efficient manner, because that's ultimately what it's about. Because what we're going to talk about next is obviously, what people maybe don't expect about the industry. And so, there is a lot of pressure. There's a lot of emotional pressure. When you think about a home loan or a home purchase and you think about the loan side of things, you are dealing with people's livelihoods. So, we've had a lot of clients who obviously you get very excited, you're ready to move in. I was actually on the phone with a client last week and we had a little bit of a scare before close. And he's like, man, I already have my moving truck filled up with all my stuff. I'm supposed to be out tomorrow. And so there is a lot of pressure on that side when you're dealing with, obviously livelihoods of people. And so you have the emotions of a buyer, you have the emotions of real estate agents, you have the emotions of your own team and your own back office, you have, the pressure of listing agents and sellers. And so there's a lot of things going on inside of a transaction that can create pressure. So, what I've learned in my time in the business is obviously communication is key. I know we've drilled that into every part of our podcast that we've dropped in the last year and a half with you guys is communication. And so, that's really what I have and what, we have here at Kaysen built into the foundation of who we are as a company and who we are as people is communicating. And that oftentimes relieves a lot of that pressure is when you're open and when you're honest about things that are going on and making sure that everybody's on the same page. Some other things that people don't expect, or maybe they do have a general sense of it or an understanding is, back on kind of that freedom part, typically, I guess, depending on the company that you work for and the structure in which you are a loan officer, but most loan officers are a commission based structure. So you do not receive a salary, you do not receive an hourly wage, anything like that. You are commissioned. So as most people know in a commission based business, what business you bring in, you get paid on. So, and if you don't bring in business, then you're not going to get paid. And so that's one of those things where, that can also add pressure, to you, the individual. Everybody starts their journey differently. I'm grateful enough that I got started, I'm not married. I don't have kids. I have myself to, take into account on. And so, there's a little bit less pressure there for me personally. Obviously I still have my own livelihood to consider, but, somebody who may enter this industry new and you have a wife, you have kids, you have a family to provide for, there's going to be that added pressure there on your end to make sure that you're making money, right? Because when you're in a commission based business, that is basically built on what you bring to the table. So that leads into unpredictable income, right? Commission-based income. Sometimes you're going to have really good months. Maybe sometimes you're going to have really bad months. Sometimes you may just find yourself in a middle range. And so it's not, what is the word? Stability, right? Some people, they come in and they want a stable job, right? They want to know what they're going to make every 2 weeks or every week or however your pay is structured with your company. They want to know that when that money hits, they're getting this same amount every single week. But ultimately, when you get yourselves into those positions, normally, unless you have built yourself into a higher up level over years, you're going to be a little bit limited on what income can be earned when you're in a salary or hourly position, right? That is going to be based on, typically value brought, time spent with company. Every company operates a little bit differently on how they decide how to raise and pay their employees. But, with a commission based, job, you obviously don't necessarily have that, right? Your earning potential is whatever you are willing to do to get that earning potential. So, we already talked about a little bit client communication. That is one of the big things. You have to be able to talk with people. You have to be able to reassure people. You have to be able to communicate in a way that makes people feel like you have their back, right? Because ultimately you are guiding someone through one of the largest purchases of their entire life. And that is on you. Most people don't understand lending guidelines. Most people don't understand underwriting conditions, the things that go on in the back end. And so you have to have a certain discernment in the way that you communicate with people so that you can provide ease for them, so that you can provide as least amount of stress in a already stressful, time in their lives. Let's just be real. Most normal people are not going to spend the amount of money that most people spend on a home and not feel some level of stress around that, because ultimately we've talked about it before, but we get emotional attachments to these things. We start feeling like this home is ours before we close the loan, as buyers. And that's something that you have to navigate as a loan officer, as a mortgage advisor, and make sure that people understand that you are doing the best that you can for them and explaining it in a way that makes them feel confident, comfortable, safe, and know that you have their back. And then another thing, I know we talked about freedom, but there are long hours involved, right? So typically the busier that you are, sometimes it's going to require a little bit of extra work. Sometimes it's going to require you to stay late, and that's, I think, a common misconception out there. I wouldn't necessarily say that what we do is entrepreneurial. I think it's entrepreneurial in spirit, but ultimately I don't own the company that I work for. So I don't have the pressure on the back end of making sure that the company is successful and those sort of things. We do have individualized pressure because we do play a role in the company being successful, but ultimately, I'm not dealing with, bottom lines on the back end, making sure that the company, just getting into that. But I'm just saying, you know, I'm not even sure how I got off on that, to be honest with you. But I guess I was talking about long hours, and just saying, in an entrepreneurial type job, it is a common misconception that there's just nothing but freedom. But the reality is that, again, you have to show up and do what is necessary to make sure that everybody that you're working with is in a good position, a good spot. And so, there have been times in this business where we have been very, very busy and there's been a lot going on, and I've had to work longer than a 9 to 5, right? And sometimes, we have to take calls on the weekends and we have to do different things and make sure that we're helping people and getting where they need to go. I always like to remind people that, when you're in this business, a lot of people do work during the week, right? When you talk to most people, they work Monday through Friday. So they don't necessarily have time to go view homes Monday through Friday. So when it is their free time, they're going to go on weekends. They're going to go on Friday evenings. They're going to go on Sundays. And so, you have to be flexible in this business and understand that, sometimes we work 7 days a week. Yes, we're not sitting down in the office on a Sunday for 9 hours a day working, but sometimes you do have to be available, and there's nothing wrong with that. In my personal opinion, I enjoy it. And I think that that's what makes the business, unique, because there's times where, I get to cut out on a Friday and go play golf or do different things. And I don't necessarily have to be tied to my desk all hours of the day, but I do know that that could also come with, hey, I'm going to have to spend a little bit of additional time on this day or this day to make up for that. So it's very much so, you kind of go at your own, your own pace sort of thing, right? You have that freedom to make decisions. And if you want to kind of cut out a little bit early one day, you just may know that, you may have to make that up before or after, right? So long hours is another one. And then obviously we already talked about it, but stress, this can be a very stressful business. Again, we are dealing not with lives or anything like that, but we are dealing with livelihoods. And so, especially when you get into, multi home situations where you're working with a buyer who's also selling their home, and then that buyer's buying a home, or that buyer's buying their home, and then you have like a trickle down effect of multiple transactions all tied to the one. You're going to have a lot of emotions and a lot of things going on there. And so there can be situations where the business does create high stress. And, ultimately you have to figure out how to burden that yourself and how to take that on the chin and best show up the best way that you can for everyone around you, because I'm a big firm believer in, I'm not going to pass that stress on to my clients. I'm going to do everything that I possibly can to shoulder that stress myself and make sure that whatever we do, we go above and beyond for them, and put them in the best position possible. So, those are a couple of things that maybe, when you start with why do people get in this, freedom and, income ability, I feel like I learned a long time ago, that the amount of income that you have the potential to earn is directly tied to how much responsibility and responsibility that you have. So if you want to be a loan officer who is, closing, you're making $1 million a year, right? You're going to have a lot more going on, which is then going to put a lot more stress on you. Oftentimes, there are systems and teams that can be built to mitigate those things, so that you can build in the right way. But, your income earning ability is directly tied to the level of stress that you can handle, I think, and the amount of value that you can provide inside of that. So, again, you're not just doing loans, you're managing emotions of everybody involved in the transaction, because you got to think of it, the lender is kind of the last stop, right? You have a house, you have a real estate agent, you have somebody helping you, go find the right house for you. But the biggest thing is that you have to get financing for it in most cases, right? Unless you're doing some sort of cash offer. If you're doing financing, then the lender is kind of the last step before that house becomes, the person who's looking to buy it. And so there's going to be a lot there. So just something to keep in mind. Now, getting into the next thing, talking about, kind of goes into why people get involved in the business, but what makes the business rewarding? What makes this a career path that somebody might be interested in? I think the biggest thing is helping people, getting to know people, getting to hear their life story, getting to know who they are, and helping them do one of the biggest things that they may ever do in their entire lives. And then getting to be a part of that afterwards, right? Following up with your clients, getting to talk with them, getting to hear about what they've done with the house, what their plans are with the house, and then being able to help them manage that debt or manage that mortgage for for years to come. And so that you're always making sure that they're in the best position possible. And I think that is, for me, that is the most rewarding thing that this business offers me. And sorry, I just, thinking about a little bit about, some clients that we worked with, and just, reviews that they've left, and just things that they've said, and just, you feel like, honestly, like you can build lifelong relationships in this outside of business. It's not just about a transaction. It's not just about money. It's not just about those things. You're actively helping someone achieve something in their life, and being a part of one of the greatest things, in my opinion, buying a home. And so, I think that in and of itself makes it one of the most rewarding industries. Now, I know there's obviously other things that we're going to talk about here, but, right there, helping people buy homes and building those personal relationships with them throughout that process, and getting to know them for who they are, and understanding that you are working with people on the other end, right? This is not a number. This is not a numbers game. You're helping people, and you're getting to be a part of their life, and a part of, playing a small role in their journey ultimately. So I think that's one of the most amazing things, and one of the things that would have it to where I probably will never leave this business, barring anything crazy, because I just love that part of it so much. And then obviously talking a little bit about like the personal growth side of things, like I myself have experienced a lot of personal growth over the years. This business has forced me to come out of a comfort zone and push myself in ways that, maybe I otherwise wouldn't, depending on a different career path. I think that's one of the most important things for me personally, is the level of personal growth that I've experienced. Because ultimately, when you get to know people, when you get to build relationships with people, you're building a skill set of understanding and how to talk with people, how to communicate. And I think that that's extremely valuable. So I have experienced large amounts of personal growth over the last 8 years, and there's been ebbs and flows in that. There's been down seasons, there's been up seasons. And, ultimately, it is, I don't know that I would be in the position that I am today without everything that this business has taught me, even just from a human to human level, right? And so you strip away the homes of it all, you strip away the loans and the financing of it all. What skills have you built inside of that translate into other areas of life? And I feel like there's been a lot of really good skills that I've built, interpersonal communication, empathy, caring, all these different things that, I think are very, very important, and maybe things that are not as common in today's world, just with the social media age, and, mostly people keeping to themselves. I know that, we have people in my generation and younger than me, we have obviously a large uphill battle when it comes to these sort of things, because, of the way that we have been raised around cell phones and raised around social media, and all of the communication normally happening through a device and not happening face to face. Back in the 1990s, 80s, 70s, those things were not, you had, bag phones or whatever, you had landlines, and things like that. So, if you wanted to talk to somebody or get together with somebody, you had to, you had to have that interpersonal communication, and be able to, build those skills. And so I think that that's something that's really, really important, something I'm extremely grateful for building inside of my career. And it's something that I still have a lot of work to do. There's no doubt about that. I'm nowhere close to where I want to be, but I know that, I've definitely worked very, very hard on that. And so, I think the personal growth in the business itself is something that's extremely rewarding. Freedom and flexibility over time. We already talked about that a little bit, but obviously, yes, the business does afford freedom and flexibility. You do have the ability to kind of pick up and go where you need to. I always talk with people that, I'm sure you guys know, based on the background and based on what the background was, I was in Florida for about 5 months. I spent some time down there with my brother who lives down there. And, people ask, well, did you get a job when you came back? I'm like, I worked my job while I was down there, right? Maybe yes, necessarily I'm not face to face with clients while I'm away, obviously. However, I still have a phone. I can still pick up the phone and call them. I can work wherever my laptop is at. So, as long as I have internet connection, I have my laptop with me, I can do everything that needs to be done inside of, the business by doing that, which obviously is going to afford freedom and flexibility, the ability to travel, the ability to go different places and still not be like, if I'm not at work, I can't accomplish anything, right? Because you could still just, you're going on a trip, fire up your laptop, work for a couple hours, and then go enjoy whatever trip you're on or whatever you're doing. And so that is something else that is very, very lucrative to most people, right? Having that freedom and having that flexibility. And I've watched it over the course of my life as well. Obviously, I told you guys, my dad's been in the business for 27 years. So the ability for him to pick up and be able to go and do things, take us on trips and go and still be able to work and still accomplish what he needs to do while being away, has obviously been a big benefiting factor for him and for the family as well. Again, in my opinion. So, and then obviously you have that business ownership mindset that comes along with it. That's another rewarding thing. Like I said, we don't own the company, so from an entrepreneurial standpoint, I wouldn't necessarily say that we're entrepreneurs. We're not starting and owning our own business and running our own business. However, it is a business within a business, right? You are creating a personal brand around who you are, the services that you provide, and the level that you bring to each and every single one of your clients and your relationships. And so, ultimately you are as good as, those things. So there is that level to it where you do have a little bit of a business owner mindset, because you have to think about, well, what is my personal brand saying? What is, my action saying? What are these saying? And how do I get people to want to work with me? And how do I get clients to trust and want to, go through one of the largest purchase transactions of their life with me? What do those things look like and how do I create that? And then obviously, yes, you have a company on the back end who helps facilitate those loans, get them through processing, get them through underwriting, get them closed. But again, it's all going to be based on your personal brand that you have built around yourself. So, there's that side of it as well. So there is a business owner mindset. There is an entrepreneurial spirit about the business and about the position of being a mortgage advisor or a loan officer that, again, can make the business or, make the career rewarding. You do learn, in my opinion, I have learned different business tactics. I would not say I'm well-versed in business like that at all, but you do pick up little things along the way. Again, still have a very, very long way to go in learning all there is to know about that side of things. So getting into, again, what or who this career might be good for, right? So if you were considering maybe a career switch, it's funny, I talked with that client. He was like, hey, you should really do an episode on, becoming a loan officer and what that looks like. And I literally had a client call me 2 days later and was asking me all the questions like, hey, how do you get licensed? How does this go? And so it was just funny that both of those, interactions happened in like the same week. And so getting into who I think the career path would be good for. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that if somebody here is not listed, or if you don't feel like this, doesn't mean that you wouldn't be good in the career path. Just these are kind of the people that I think would be like, this would be like almost a calling to them. Right. And so I think people who are self-starters, so somebody who, maybe self-starter is not the best word. Maybe I would use like self-motivated, because I don't think, like, again, depending on the company you work for, but it's not like our company execs are calling us or the company owners are calling us and saying, hey, you need to be kicking your butt into gear doing this, this, and this. It's very much so a self-motivated business. So if you want it, you're going to have to go get it. And there's not going to be necessarily anybody coming around kicking you on the butt saying, hey, let's go get this, let's go figure it out, sort of thing, right? So you have to be very self-motivated, and I think have a very large why as to why you're doing what you're doing, and the reasoning behind that. Because again, there's going to be days where you don't feel like it, right? And you're still going to have to show up on those days where you don't feel like it, especially again in a commission based business. I think somebody who's very people oriented, I think that's really, really important. Our new hire, I look at him and he is very, very, why is the word blanking on me? Extroverted. Sorry. He's very, very extroverted, right? And so loves people. You can tell it in his voice when he starts to talk, like he just genuinely loves those conversations and those different things. And so he was talking to me and we were talking about like all the different things that you could do inside of the mortgage business, processing, underwriting, closing departments, back office when it comes to, post closings and quality control and all those different things. And he was like, well, maybe I'd be an underwriter. I'm like, brother, I'll tell you right now, I've only known you for about a month, but there's no chance you would want to be an underwriter because he loves to talk. He loves to be around people, and underwriters, unfortunately, are very much so into the paperwork every single day, reviewing files, making sure that guidelines are being met, that sort of thing. And so, again, as a loan officer, you have to know those things. Maybe not every loan guideline out there. I don't know that knowing everything is going to make you the best loan officer on the planet. I think having a good blend of really good people skills and then having a blend of obviously general knowledge when it comes to what you are helping people with, the different loans that are available to them, I think obviously is really, really important on that front. But you're gonna have to be people oriented. If you're not people oriented, I don't know that this is necessarily the best business for you. I think you have to genuinely care and want to know people and want to talk with them. Resilient personalities. So people that can, be resilient in the face of adversity, because I'll be honest that you're gonna reach some adversity in this business. There's just no doubt about it. You're gonna have stressful times. You're gonna have deals that maybe make you want to pull your hair out and are very challenging to get to the closing table. And you're going to deal with a lot of stress, and you're going to deal with setbacks, and you're going to deal with things that are not always easy, and you have to be resilient in the face of those. And again, I think that's a skill that you can build up over time. But if you are someone who already experiences that little bit of resilience in your life and your day-to-day things, I think that's going to be very, very helpful for you coming into this business, because there are things that are going to pop up that certainly are not going to be easy and are going to be tough to navigate. And that will certainly make it a lot easier if you already have a little bit of that resilience in your personality. And then discipline people. That kind of goes back into self-starters or being self-motivated, being disciplined, doing the things that you need to do, even when it's inconvenient to do it, even when you don't feel like doing it. Again, when you're in a business that you're not necessarily being regulated by other people, you're being self-regulated. You have to have a really good grasp on what those things are internally and making sure that you're showing up in the way that you need to day in and day out. And that's not always an easy thing, right? We all know that, you go through life sometimes and you have bad days and days you don't feel like doing things and days where, maybe your mental's real rough and things are not always easy. And inside of that, showing up regardless of that as the best version of yourself is really, really important, because that is another thing in this business. Time does not sit by. Normally you think 30-day contracts, and I've thought this myself. We get a contract and like, oh yeah, we got till this, and then snap of a finger, by the time you look at it, you're a week away from closing. And so if you don't get up and do the things that you need to do to help get that client to the closing table, if you're not out generating the business that you need to generate, having the conversations that you need to have, those things are going to be challenges for you, and you're going to experience a lot more friction when that is the case. And so you have to be very disciplined in this business to show up, when you need to. And so, at the end of the day, this business is not for everybody, and that's okay. There's a lot of other businesses out there. I mean, every business is not for everybody, right? There's different personality types, there's different people, and there are certain things that are really good for some people and really, things that are not good for others. Like me personally, I don't think I could ever work in a healthcare position. I go to like a hospital and, it gives me kind of like the EBGBs, I just don't know. Like there's just something about it. And I commend anybody and everybody who works in that career path. My sister works in that career path. And so I, I am, I'm amazed at how they show up and do what they do. And I think that it's amazing. It's just not something for me personally. Right. And so this business is not going to always be something for everybody, but it is a very fulfilling business if that is something that, you feel like you can kind of meet, or, feel like you resonate with some of those things that we're talking about. Right. So, I mean, guys, that's kind of really all I wanted to talk with you guys about today. I guess we end up being over 40 minutes here, I guess I get to talking and don't really realize how much time passes. But, just a kind of I guess a little bit of a closing thought for you. Again, I hope you guys found some value in this. If this is something that you guys are interested in doing or pursuing, hopefully it gives you a little bit more insight into what the business looks like. And, you know, not all businesses are glamorous, and not everything's going to be perfect always, but I think that if you are a people person, this can be one of the most rewarding career paths that you take, in my opinion. I know that from my personal experience, it certainly has been for me. And I can't say put into words how grateful I am for the experience that I've had the last 8 years and everything that I've learned and all the people that I've gotten to meet along the way, and excited for obviously many, many years to come. So again, hopefully this helped you guys, give you guys a little bit of insight into, the career path of a loan officer, mortgage advisor, whatever you want to call them. And yeah, if anybody's considering a career path in this and wants more information, don't hesitate to reach out. Let me know. Be more than happy to connect with you, talk about anything a little bit more in depth that you guys, may be interested in. And yeah, hopefully you found some value in the episode. So appreciate you guys. As you guys know, a little housekeeping before we let you go. We drop new episodes every Friday, noon Eastern, on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. So YouTube's going to have our audio and video version, and then audio only on Apple and Spotify podcast platforms. So appreciate you guys. If you guys give us a listen there. And then also we have Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube for our short contents and some different stuff that comes there. So feel free to give us a follow. Please feel free to subscribe. Appreciate you guys as always. And of course, we will see you again on our next episode. So have a good rest of your week, and we will talk with you guys later. See ya.